Have you ever craved silence so badly you ran toward the middle of nowhere just to hear your own thoughts again? Claire Bennett wasn't running from anyone. At least, that's what she told herself when she booked a remote cabin in the Oregon mountains, hoping for a weekend of peace after losing the only person who ever truly saw her. But when she opened the door, he was already there, Julian Cross, her billionaire boss, cold, unreachable. And now, the only other soul trapped with her in a cabin cut off by wildfire. If it were you, would you stay and share the silence with the man who never noticed you before? Or walk back into the storm alone? Sometimes, the person you're trying hardest to forget is the only one who can truly see you. Stay with this story. It might just remind you of the quiet you've been missing. Claire Bennett hadn't packed much, just one suitcase with a few books, a worn wool sweater, a bottle of lavender oil she never used but always carried, and a pair of boots she'd forgotten she owned. She didn't need much. Not for where she was going, not for what she needed to leave behind. It had been a long month. Actually, it had been a long year, the kind of year that quietly exhausts you. The kind no one asks about because, on the outside, you seem fine. On paper, Claire was doing well. 28, executive secretary to the CEO of one of Seattle's fastest-growing tech firms, efficient, discreet, always composed. But lately, the silence after work felt louder than the city traffic outside her apartment window. When her mother passed away 6 weeks ago, Claire hadn't told anyone at the office. Not because she wanted to be strong, but because grief, to her, was private. Sacred. She had been raised by her adoptive mother, a school librarian who loved secondhand paperbacks and humming old country songs in the kitchen. They had lived in a small house with a crooked porch and a dog named Beans. That little life had been enough for Claire, until the world insisted she dream bigger, faster, louder. Now, her mother was gone, the house was sold, Beans had died years ago, and Claire, who once felt steady and clear, was suddenly floating above her own life. The only thing she wanted was to feel the ground again. That's why she booked the cabin. It was tucked away near Clearwater Lake, not far from Mount Hood in Oregon, a little log house with one bedroom, a wood stove, and a porch that looked out over still water. No cell reception, no Wi-Fi, no smart locks or digital assistants, just pine trees, the quiet ripple of wind over water, and, hopefully, sleep. Real sleep. Claire had found the place through a corporate perk. Portal employees of her company got access to remote cabins for wellness retreats. She booked the weekend without thinking twice, using 2 of her remaining vacation days. She left a note on her desk calendar, out Frymon, and vanished into the mist of Thursday evening traffic. The drive took almost 5 hours, including a detour for hot coffee and a stretch under gas station lights. She drove in silence, no radio, no podcasts, just the hum of the tires and the ache of her shoulders. When she finally turned off the main highway, the 2-lane road narrowed into gravel, curving through woods that grew denser with each passing mile. By the time she reached the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the ridges, leaving the trees in dark silhouette. Claire parked beside an old fence, turned off the ignition, and just sat. For a moment, breathing. The air was colder here, thinner somehow, like it carried fewer expectations. Grabbing her suitcase, she stepped onto the path, gravel crunching beneath her boots. The pine scent was sharp, almost medicinal, and the cabin stood quietly in front of her, small, weathered, but welcoming. She climbed the porch steps slowly, her breath forming little clouds in the air. Then she saw it, The porch light was already on. Claire froze. The front door was slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened, a flicker of something between fear and confusion rising in her chest. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. The cabin was supposed to be empty. She reached out and pushed the door open. Inside, a fire crackled softly in the hearth. The warm glow lit the room in amber gold, casting flickering shadows across the wooden floor. A coffee mug sat on the counter, steam still rising. And standing near the window, sleeves rolled up, no tie, no briefcase, was Julian Cross. Claire stopped breathing. Julian Cross, CEO of the company she worked for, the man who passed her desk every morning, without looking, the one everyone admired, feared, or secretly tried to impress. He was here, in this cabin, looking just as stunned as she felt. "Claire," he said, voice low, eyes narrowing. She took a step back, suitcase slipping slightly from her hand. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing," he replied. Silence. A long one. Claire's mind raced. Had she mixed up the dates? Was this a mistake? Or worse, had she just walked into something she couldn't walk back out of? Outside, the trees swayed gently, whispering things she couldn't hear. Inside, the room stood still. Between them, the weight of something unspoken. And the weekend hadn't even begun. The silence between them was thick enough to hold its own weight. Claire stood in the doorway, one foot still outside on the porch, her hand gripping the worn leather handle of her suitcase. Inside, Julian Cross, billionaire, boss. The man who signed her paychecks, without ever quite remembering her name, was staring at her like she'd stepped out of some parallel universe. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the soft pop and hiss of the fire filled the room. Julian blinked first. "I didn't expect anyone," he said slowly, setting his mug down on the windowsill. The sound of ceramic against wood oddly final. Claire stepped in slightly, still unsure whether she should retreat or demand answers. "I booked this cabin for the weekend, through the company wellness portal. I needed a break." Julian tilted his head, studying her as if trying to match her face to a folder in some memory drawer. "I booked it months ago, through my assistant. Personal booking." Claire's heart sank. Her stomach tightened. A double booking of all the cabins, all the weekends, all the people. Why him? Why now? She closed the door behind her slowly as a sharp gust of cold wind tried to sneak in, rattling the porch light. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a quiet wave, pine-scented air, the hum of the fire, the faint smell of coffee. "I can find another place," she muttered, setting her suitcase near the doorway. "There is no other place," Julian said, walking past her toward the fireplace. "The road is already closed off. Wildfire warning. Didn't you get the alert?" Claire shook her head, pulling her phone from her coat pocket. No service, not even one bar. "No." He rubbed the back of his neck, visibly uncomfortable. "Fire's not here yet, but they've closed off access routes as a precaution," said the wind shifted. "This area is effectively cut off for now." Claire stared at him, processing. She could hear the wind howling just beyond the cabin walls now, like it knew something they didn't. "So we're stuck," Julian nodded once. "For now. Maybe just overnight. Could be longer." She exhaled slowly, unzipping her coat and folding it over the arm of a nearby chair. The weight of it matched the weight in her chest. "Fine. We stay out of each other's way." "Fine," he echoed, not unkindly. They didn't speak much as Claire moved about the cabin, familiarizing herself with the space she thought would be hers alone. The place was rustic but beautiful. Hand-hewn beams, wide-planked floors, shelves lined with old hardcovers, a braided rug near the fireplace. There was a small kitchen with a gas stove, a weathered sink, and the kind of coffee pot that made real coffee. Not the single-serve kind. Claire found the second bedroom tucked behind the kitchen, small, clean, and blessedly separate. She unpacked in silence, her movements automatic. She laid out her sweater on the bed, plugged in her toothbrush, even though there was no signal, and stared at her own reflection in the small mirror above the dresser. What were the odds? What kind of story started like this later that evening? As darkness pressed against the windows and the fire threw shifting shadows across the wooden walls, Claire emerged from her room. Julian was at the table, sleeves still rolled, flipping through a worn paperback. He looked up when she entered, but didn't speak. She sat across the room, curled into the armchair by the fire, pulling her knees close, fingers wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea. "Do you come here often?" she asked eventually, surprising herself. He glanced at her. "Once or twice a year. When I can." He paused, then added, "My dad used to bring me here. Before the company. Before all of that." Claire looked over, truly seeing him now, not as the man in tailored suits, not as the figure behind boardroom glass, but as someone strangely out of place in a cabin, yet comfortable there too. Julian leaned back slightly. "I keep this place because it's quiet. I like the quiet. So do I," she said. Another silence settled between them, but it didn't feel so sharp this time. Outside, the wind had picked up. A distant rumble rolled over the hills like a low warning. The trees moaned against the pressure. Claire stood. "Do you have candles?" Julia nodded toward a drawer in the kitchen, top left. She found a box of matches and a few thick white candles, placing them carefully around the room, one on the mantel, one on the table, one on the windowsill. As she struck the match, the light flared and danced, casting golden arcs over their faces. "I guess we're in this together," she said softly. Julian met her eyes. For once, he didn't look away. "I guess we are." The first night passed like fog silent, thick, and impossible to hold on to. Claire barely slept. The walls creaked with every gust of wind. The fire hissed softly in the hearth, its glow flickering across the wooden ceiling beams. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear Julian shifting in the guest room, the occasional floorboard groaning beneath his step, the soft thud of a book being set down. And beyond the walls, the storm of smoke and silence continued to wrap itself around the cabin like a second skin. The air felt too still, like nature was waiting for something. By morning, the light was a soft gray, filtered through heavy clouds and the distant haze of drifting ash. Claire stood at the kitchen sink, staring out through the foggy window. The lake, which should have shimmered with early sunlight, looked flat and silver, like a mirror waiting to crack. Julian sat at the table, sipping black coffee from the same ceramic mug. He hadn't said much, and neither had she. There was something oddly civilized about the arrangement, two people sharing a house, avoiding eye contact, orbiting each other carefully like planets who didn't want to collide. He offered her coffee with a quiet gesture, lifting the pot slightly in her direction. She nodded and held out her mug. Their fingers didn't touch, but the space between them sparked with something unspoken. Not tension, not yet, just something neither had the words for. By noon, they had settled into a kind of temporary truce. Claire took the armchair near the window and read a paperback she'd brought, something soft and slow, about a woman who ran a bakery by the sea. Julian sat on the couch. Laptop open, but idle. Occasionally, she'd glance up and see him watching the fire, lost in thought. It felt strange, being in the same space but not speaking. Stranger still was the feeling that she didn't want to leave. Not really. Not yet. It was the first time in a long while that silence didn't feel like a punishment. That afternoon, the power cut out, a soft click, followed by the quiet sigh of appliances dying. The heater went still. The lights dimmed. Claire froze mid-page. Julian stood immediately. "I'll check the panel," he said, already moving toward the back hallway. She followed without thinking, grabbing a flashlight from the drawer. The cabin's utility panel was tucked behind a closet door near the back porch. Julian opened it, flipped a few breakers, then stepped back, dead. "Probably a transformer or line issue," he said, "because of the fire," she asked, "or wind, or ice. Could be anything." He closed the panel. They stood there for a second, the flashlight beam illuminating their faces in soft white light. Claire noticed the way his jaw was set tight, but not angry, more like a man used to control, now realizing he had none. "Guess we're back to candles and firewood," she said with a half smile. He returned the smile small, almost reluctant. "You build the fire, I'll make soup." And just like that, they moved together. No debate, no friction, just two people doing what needed to be done. Claire stacked logs, coaxed the flame, adjusted the damper until the fire roared to life again. Julian chopped vegetables, humming quietly to himself, moving with surprising ease in the kitchen. When she joined him, he was stirring lentils and carrots into a simmering broth that smelled like rosemary and warmth. "You cook?" she asked, amused. He raised an eyebrow. "You sound surprised. I thought CEOs only ate things brought to them on white plates. That's not inaccurate," he said with a soft laugh. "But this, I know how to do." They ate at the table, hunched over mismatched bowls. The soup was hearty and imperfect. The carrots were a little undercooked, the salt uneven, but Claire hadn't tasted anything that comforting in months. It wasn't just the food. It was the silence between bites, the flicker of candlelight on the old wood, the way Julian sat with his elbows on the table, sleeves rolled, like a man who wasn't wearing a mask. She found herself watching him, truly watching, not as the man who passed her desk every morning without noticing her, not as the cold figure in the boardroom, but as someone very human, someone who, maybe, had also been carrying something too long. After dinner, she curled up in the armchair again, legs tucked under her, holding a second cup of tea. Julian sat on the rug near the fire, a blanket draped around his shoulders, the hem trailing behind him like a cloak. "Why do you really come here?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The fire popped softly, sending a trail of sparks upward. "My father brought me here the summer before he died," he said at last. "He wasn't a kind man, not at home, not in business. But here he was different. He read books out loud, he made pancakes, he laughed." Claire watched his face as he spoke. It was the first time she'd seen him not calculating, not composed, just present. "I guess I come here to remember that version of him," he said, "even if it only lasted a weekend." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes that's enough." They fell into silence again, but this time, it felt like something shared, not something to fill. The room was quiet, and the storm outside, the one they'd both carried inside their chests, felt a little further away. As she stood to head to her room, Julian looked up at her. "You don't have to tiptoe around me," he said softly. She paused. "You're my boss. I'm a man in a cabin," he replied, "just like you're a woman in one." Claire didn't answer, but her cheeks warmed as she walked down the hall, the firelight fading behind her, and in the quiet of that night, with no phone, no internet, no noise, something fragile and invisible began to shift. Something that neither of them would name. Not yet. The next morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost sacred. No wind, no birds, not even the rustle of pine needles. The world outside the cabin was wrapped in a pale hush, as if nature itself had paused to take a breath. Smoke from the distant fires had drifted over the lake like a veil, tinting the light a soft, eerie gold. Claire sat on the front steps, her fingers curled around a mug of coffee, gone lukewarm. The ceramic was warm against her palms, grounding her in a way nothing else had managed to lately. She stared out at the lake, which shimmered faintly beneath the morning haze. It looked endless, like a page waiting to be written. Behind her, the door creaked. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Julian. His footsteps were slower in the mornings, heavier somehow. He sat beside her without a word, holding his own mug, the steam rising between them in slow spirals. They didn't speak right away. Sometimes silence says more than small talk ever could. Claire traced her thumb along the rim of her mug and said, almost too softly, "I used to think if I stayed quiet long enough, people would stop expecting me to say anything at all." Julian glanced sideways at her, not interrupting, just listening. She continued, "It started when I was a kid. My mother, the one who raised me. She was gentle, soft-voiced. She'd let me sit in her library while she worked. I didn't need to speak. I just had to be still, and that was enough for her." A pause. "But the rest of the world doesn't work that way. I learned that fast. If you're quiet, people assume you have nothing to say. Or worse, they decide what your silence means for you." Julian looked down at his coffee, then back at the lake. His voice, when it came, was lower than usual. "I know that silence. I've lived inside it for years." Claire turned to him slowly, surprised. "My father was a man who believed in power, not presence," Julian said. "He filled every room he walked into, but not with warmth. He made people feel small, just to prove that he was big. At home, we didn't talk. We performed. We behaved. We followed rules he never had to write down." He paused. The air around them held the memory like breath, held too long. "The first time I laughed too loud at the dinner table, he sent me to my room without a word. Just a look. It took me years to understand that love doesn't have to be earned with obedience." Claire's voice caught slightly. "And do you believe that now Julian didn't answer right away? Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee and exhaled through his nose. I believe it more when I'm here, less when I'm not." They sat there for a while longer, shoulder to shoulder, though not quite touching. The sun tried to push through the smoky sky, but gave up halfway, settling into a hazy half-light that made everything look softer, quieter. Inside the cabin, the fire had gone out. Claire returned to the hearth while Julian gathered kindling. As they moved around each other, handing matches, folding blankets, slicing apples for breakfast, something invisible shifted. There was an ease that hadn't been there before, not comfort exactly, but the absence of resistance. Later that afternoon, they took a walk around the edge of the lake. The trail was narrow, damp with morning dew, littered with pine cones and broken branches from the windstorm 2 nights prior. They didn't talk much, but when they did, the words came naturally. Julian told her about college, how he'd majored in economics because it was expected, not because it inspired him. He'd wanted to study architecture once, before it was made clear that creativity didn't belong in the Cross family business. Claire laughed lightly. "You'd have made a good architect. You seem like someone who needs structure." He smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. "I didn't think you noticed me enough to know that." "I notice more than people think," she replied, almost a whisper. As they walked, a single gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying the faintest sound of something, maybe distant sirens, maybe only imagination. They paused for a moment, both listening, waiting for the world to tell them what came next. When it didn't, they continued walking, steps slower now. At one point, they reached a clearing where the trees opened up and the lake stretched wide and silver in front of them. A fallen log sat beside the trail, and Claire moved to sit, brushing pine needles away with the edge of her sleeve. Julian joined her, not too close, not too far. Claire looked out over the water and said, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Julian's response came after a long moment. "Only when I stop long enough to realize I don't remember choosing mine." She turned to him. "So why don't you change it? Because changing it means admitting I've been hiding," he said. "And I've worked too hard convincing the world that I don't feel anything." Claire looked at him then, not the man in headlines, not the figure behind spreadsheets and press releases, but the person underneath all that armor. "I don't think you're as hidden as you believe," she said gently. He looked at her, really looked, and for a heartbeat, she felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. But just as quickly, he dropped his gaze. "I'm trying," he said, "but it's hard to stop pretending when pretending is what made you survive." The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the trees behind them like a whisper of truth. Claire felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not sadness, just the quiet ache of recognizing your own reflection in someone else's story. They sat in silence until the sun began to slip behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows over the water. When they stood, they walked back to the cabin, a little closer than before, not touching, but tethered by something that no longer needed to be named. That night, the air inside the cabin felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding on to everything left unsaid. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the ceiling beams, and the candles flickered slightly with each breath of wind that pressed against the windows. Claire sat curled on the end of the couch, blanket draped across her knees, a book resting closed on her lap. She hadn't turned a page in half an hour. Julian had disappeared into his room after dinner, saying something about catching up on notes he'd scribbled in a leather-bound journal, the kind that smelled like ink and old paper. Claire had nodded politely, but inside, her thoughts were elsewhere, drifting back to their conversation by the lake, to the way his voice had softened when he talked about pretending, about survival, about not knowing how to stop. There was something in him she hadn't expected to find, a fracture, a warmth, a quiet ache. She stood and stretched, then wandered into the kitchen to refill her tea. The kettle was still warm on the stove, and she smiled faintly as she poured Earl Grey. He'd remembered that she liked it, even though she didn't recall ever telling him. Maybe he noticed more than she gave him credit for. As she returned to the living room, her gaze drifted to the edge of the table, where Julian's phone sat. He must have left it behind by accident. She picked it up instinctively, intending to set it aside. but the screen lit up in her hand with a soft buzz. One new notification. The banner was vague, just a name she didn't recognize, and the word attachment. Claire hesitated. It wasn't her business. And yet, something in her stomach twisted. She tapped the screen, just to turn it off. That's all. But instead, it opened. The phone had no lock code. The image filled the screen before she could stop it. It was a photo of her, taken from across the office floor. She was at her desk, head bent, pencil tucked behind her ear, lips parted slightly as if mid-thought. The moment was candid, quiet, intimate in a way that felt intrusive, like being watched through a window she didn't know existed. Claire stared, breath caught in her throat. She scrolled without meaning to. Another photo, and another, different days, different angles, all of her. Not in a creepy way, not like some stranger lurking in the dark, but not innocent either. Not casual. Each picture felt like a secret someone had no right to keep. Her heart pounded. Before she could put the phone down, another notification buzzed across the top of the screen. Blocked number. One line. You're not the first girl he's tried to keep quiet. Claire's blood turned cold. She put the phone down slowly, backing away like it might explode. The room swam around her. The walls no longer looked warm. The fire looked like warning. She heard footsteps behind her and turned sharply. Julian stood in the hallway, barefoot, holding a mug. He paused when he saw her, his expression shifting. I was just, she stammered. He followed her gaze to the phone, saw the screen, saw her face. His shoulders tensed. Claire, I can explain. She stepped back. Explain what? That you've been taking pictures of me at work. That someone thinks I'm just one in a line of women. You've a what? Manipulated, silenced. His face flushed. It's not what it looks like. Then tell me what it is, she demanded, voice shaking. Julian took a step forward but stopped when she raised a hand. I didn't plan it, he said quietly. It wasn't like that. She crossed her arms, trying to steady herself. How long I started noticing you last year. You were quiet, composed. You reminded me of someone I lost. At first, I didn't even realize I was watching. And then I couldn't look away. Claire blinked. So you watched me, instead of speaking to me. I didn't know how to speak to you, he admitted. Every time I thought about it, I talked myself out of it. I thought I'd break something in you. She laughed bitterly. You did. You just took your time doing it. He winced. Claire, I never meant to hurt you. I didn't think no. You didn't think. She cut in, her voice rising. You took something that didn't belong to you. You saw me, but you didn't see me. You turned me into a version of myself I didn't get to choose. A pause. Heavy, stifling. He swallowed hard. That message you saw, it wasn't from someone I'm with. It's from Miranda. An old friend. She used to sit on the board. She's complicated. Claire narrowed her eyes. Is she the first? He didn't respond. She stepped back again. I need air. Claire, don't. She grabbed her coat and stepped out onto the porch. The wind had picked up. Ash fell like snow from the sky, soft and gray. The trees loomed dark against the dimming horizon, and the air smelled like burning earth. She walked, down the trail, past the edge of the lake, into the woods. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed distance, needed to think. The forest was quiet, muffled by smoke. Her boots crunched over damp leaves and gravel. Her lungs stung from the haze. But she didn't stop. Not yet. Somewhere behind her, She imagined Julian calling her name, but she didn't turn around. Because in that moment, Claire wasn't afraid of being lost in the woods. She was afraid of being found by someone who only saw her when it was already too late. The deeper Claire walked into the trees, the less the world made sense. She didn't have a flashlight. Her coat was barely warm enough. And though the trail curved gently along the edge of the lake, the smoke had thickened so much that even the familiar outline of the water had vanished. Everything was fog and shadow, and the sound of her own breath shallow, uneven, brittle in her throat. It was colder now. The air bit at her skin. But she welcomed it. At least the cold didn't lie. At least it didn't look at her like she was something to be studied, collected, and hidden. She didn't know how long she had been walking. Time felt loose, untied from its usual rhythm. It could have been 5 minutes or 50. Her boots scraped over rocks, slipped on damp earth, crunched over fallen pine needles. At one point, she passed a tree she swore she had already seen. Still, she didn't turn back. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that photo on Julian's phone, the one where she looked peaceful, unaware, and the message, "You're not the first girl he's tried to keep quiet," echoed in her head like a whisper sewn into the lining of her thoughts. She didn't want to believe it, but wasn't that always the trap? Believing someone saw you, only to find out they never really did. Her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled forward, catching herself against a mossy boulder. Her palms scraped against the rough surface, and she hissed under her breath. The sting was immediate, real, anchoring. The smoke grew denser. It clung to her clothes, her hair, her lungs. She coughed once, then again, harder. Her eyes watered. Her chest ached. Somewhere behind her, a branch cracked. A bird, startled or choking, took off into the trees. Claire leaned forward, resting her hands on her knees, trying to breathe through the burning in her throat. She had gone too far. The trail was gone now, lost under the same gray dust that painted the sky. And in that moment, just a sliver of one, she felt small. Not in a metaphorical way, not in the poetic, soul-searching kind of way, but physically, profoundly small, like the world could swallow her whole and forget it ever happened. A wave of dizziness swept over her. She reached out to steady herself on the nearest tree trunk, but the bark slipped under her hand like wet paper, and she slid to the ground, knees buckling beneath her. The world tilted. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. And then there were footsteps, not soft, not imagined, real, measured, quickening. She blinked, trying to focus, but everything was blurred with ash and exhaustion, and something deeper, something like disappointment, twisting itself into grief. Claire, the voice cut through the haze. She closed her eyes. She wasn't sure she wanted it to be him, but it was. Julian dropped to his knees beside her, one hand bracing her back, the other lifting her chin gently. "Claire, hey, look at me," he said, his voice rough, frantic, in a way she'd never heard before. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, only a cough. "I've got you," he whispered, pulling her up into his arms without waiting for permission. She didn't fight him. She couldn't. The smoke swirled around them, angry and hungry, but Julian moved quickly, retracing the path she had lost. She buried her face against his shoulder, the warmth of his flannel shirt pressing against her cheek, the rhythm of his breath steady and close. He didn't speak again until they reached the edge of the clearing, where the air began to thin and the outline of the cabin flickered back into view through the smoke. He set her down gently on the porch steps, crouched in front of her, his hands still on her arms, as if to prove she hadn't disappeared. "What the hell were you doing out there?" he asked, not unkindly, but with a fear laced into every syllable. Claire looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "I needed to go. Into the fire, into somewhere you hadn't been." Julian's jaw clenched. He sat back on his heels, staring at the porch planks. "I know what it looked like," he said quietly. "I know what you think." Claire shook her head slowly, her voice steadier now, but low. "It's not just about the pictures, Julian, or the message. It's about not knowing what parts of me you saw and what parts you imagined." He closed his eyes. She continued. "I've spent most of my life trying not to be noticed, because every time someone does notice me, it's because they want something. And I thought maybe you were different." "I am different," he said, opening his eyes again. "But I'm also afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of choosing something real," he admitted. "Of wanting something I can't control." "You scare me, Claire." She let out a soft breath, bitter and gentle at the same time. "Good. You scare me too." He reached for her hand. Not like before, not with assumption or urgency, but slowly, with space for her to say no. She didn't. His fingers wrapped around hers. "I didn't follow you out there to fix anything," he said. "I followed you because I didn't want you to think I'd let you walk into that smoke alone." Claire looked at him, really looked. And for a moment, she didn't see the CEO, or the man who had disappointed her, or even the man who had rescued her. She saw someone who was just as lost as she was, and trying. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that's where something could start, not with certainty, but with showing up when it mattered most. The cabin was quiet that night, so quiet. Claire could hear the steady rhythm of her own breathing, the creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet, the occasional hiss of the fire as it settled deeper into embers. Outside, the smoke had begun to lift just slightly, though the air still smelled like something scorched. Inside, there was only warmth, and the soft clink of mugs as she set the kettle back on the stove. Julian was sitting near the hearth again, one hand resting loosely on his knee, the other holding a blanket over his shoulder, like it had always belonged there. His expression was calm, but not distant. There was something open in his eyes now, like a door had been left ajar, just enough for light to come through. Claire handed him a fresh cup of tea and sat down beside the fire, curling her knees beneath her, the heat from the flames warming her bare feet. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence between them no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like space, space for breath, for thought, for whatever came next. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but steady. "My mother used to play violin." Claire looked over, surprised not by the fact itself, but by the softness in the way he said it, like it was a name he hadn't said aloud in years. "She wasn't great at it," he continued, a hint of a smile ghosting across his mouth. "But she loved it. She used to sit by the window in the mornings and play the same Bach piece over and over. I'd sit under the piano and close my eyes. Let the sound fill everything." He paused, sipped his tea. "She died when I was 16. Cancer. Quick and cruel. My father didn't even come home from a meeting the day she passed. Just sent the driver to take me to the hospital." Claire's fingers tightened around her mug. "I didn't cry," he said. "Not then. I just sat beside her bed and listened to the machines go quiet. I remember wondering if she'd hear music one more time before she left." Claire swallowed hard, her throat tight. "You never talk about her." "I don't talk about anything," he said simply. Talking makes it real. That's not always a bad thing. No, but sometimes it's too much. They sat in the stillness again, not looking at each other, just watching the flames rise and fall. Then Claire said, almost in a whisper, I used to sing. Julian looked over at her, eyebrows lifted. I don't anymore, she added quickly, her voice almost defensive. I stopped after high school. After, well, after life got louder than the music. She traced the rim of her mug with one finger. My mom, the one who raised me, she always said I had a voice that could calm the sea. I never believed her, of course, but she believed it enough for both of us. She worked double shifts at the library just to pay for my lessons. And I wasted it. I let it go. You didn't waste it, Julian said gently. She shook her head. I stopped showing up to auditions. I started saying no to anything that might make me visible, because I was afraid that if people really saw me, they'd leave, or worse, they'd stay, but only for the version they wanted me to be. Julian nodded slowly. I know that fear. She glanced at him. Do you? I built an empire to protect it, he said, meeting her gaze without flinching. You think it's about money, or power, or some image of success, but really, I just wanted a place where no one could get close enough to leave. His honesty caught her off guard, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was ordinary, painfully ordinary, and real. Claire looked down at the fire, its orange light dancing across the old stones. Why are you telling me this now? Because if I don't, he said quietly, you'll walk out of here thinking I only followed you into that smoke because I felt guilty, or because I wanted to save face. And I didn't. She didn't respond. Not yet. I followed you, he continued, because for the first time in a long time, I felt something I didn't want to lose. Claire exhaled slowly. You don't even know me. Then let me. She looked at him. His face was calm, but not guarded. His eyes tired, but honest. And in that moment, she didn't feel manipulated, or studied, or turned into someone's idea of a dream. She felt quietly, profoundly like she was being offered a choice. Not a promise, not a plea, just a space, a chance. She stood and walked over to the window, arms folded across her chest, staring out into the dark. You know this ends, right? She said, voice low. The smoke will clear. The road will open. You'll go back to boardrooms and contracts. I'll go back to desks and silence. And we'll pretend this never happened. Julian stood behind her, close but not touching. What if we didn't? He asked. She turned, her face unreadable. What if we tried, and it fell apart? Then at least we tried, he said softly. Claire searched his face, and for once, there was no calculation there, no script, no act, just a man who had been lost in his own house of mirrors and was finally ready to step outside. She didn't answer, not yet. But she didn't walk away either. When the plow truck finally came 2 mornings later, it arrived with no sound but the slow, steady crunch of tires over packed snow and ash. No horns, no waving hands, no rush, just the quiet presence of something inevitable, a way out. Claire watched from the window, arms crossed over her chest. Her reflection ghosted faintly in the glass. The man behind the wheel didn't get out. He simply left the engine running and stared straight ahead, waiting for them to come to him. Julian stood a few feet behind her, duffel bag already packed, coat in one hand. He didn't say anything, neither did she. The cabin, once too close, now felt like something fragile. A kind of hush had settled over the space, In the last 24 hours, not awkward, not strained, just quiet in the way that follows, after something has broken and mended, if only slightly. The way people walk more carefully over a floor that once cracked. Their bags were packed before breakfast, but neither had touched the food. The fire had gone out sometime during the night, and neither had lit it again. Claire turned from the window. "We should go." Julian nodded. "I'll carry your bag." She hesitated, then shook her head. "I've got it. Outside." The cold hit sharper than before, like the air itself had been waiting to remind them that nothing stays warm forever. The trees no longer whispered. They stood still, as if they had nothing left to say. The lake, now fully visible through the cleared smoke, looked almost unreal in its stillness. They didn't speak as they loaded their things into the back of the SUV. The driver nodded, glanced in the rearview mirror, and started down the newly cleared path that led back toward the city. Claire sat by the window, her cheek against the cold glass, watching the trees pass one by one. Julian sat beside her, hands folded in his lap, gaze fixed forward. The ride down the mountain was long and quiet, not the same kind of silence they'd shared inside the cabin. This one felt harder, heavier, as if every tree they passed peeled away another layer of what they'd found, or almost found, in that hidden pocket of time. When they reached the edge of downtown, the driver turned and asked, "Drop both of you off at the same place." Julian turned to Claire. "I'll have him stop at mine. You can take the car after." Claire nodded, her voice soft. "That's fine." They said nothing else. When the SUV pulled up to Julian's building, sleek, modern, too clean to feel like home, he opened the door, then paused, one hand still on the frame. He turned to her, eyes uncertain, but not pleading. "This doesn't have to be the end," he said quietly. Claire gave him a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maybe it has to be the pause." Julian nodded. Not in defeat, but in understanding. And then he stepped out, closed the door, and disappeared into the glass tower he had built to keep the world at arm's length. The car rolled away. Claire sat back, hands folded in her lap, her suitcase beside her. She didn't cry. Not then. Not there. She simply let the quiet settle again. Let it stretch out across the seats and the city skyline. By the time she got home, the sun was beginning to slip below the rooftops. She unlocked her door, stepped inside, and dropped her bag by the hallway wall. She stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing, and then she did something she hadn't done in months. She opened her laptop, drafted a resignation letter, and hit send. No explanations, no goodbyes, just the truth. She was done pretending. It had been 33 days since Claire had walked away from the cabin. Not that she was counting, but there was something about that number clean. Just over a month that made it feel like a line drawn in time. One part of her life on one side, the rest waiting on the other. She hadn't seen Julian since that quiet goodbye in the car. No calls, no messages, no unexpected emails or flowers or boardroom encounters. She didn't know if that was his choice, or if he'd simply understood that she needed the silence. Claire hadn't gone back to work. Instead, she'd rented a small walk-up apartment on the east side of the city, closer to the bookstore she used to love in college. The one with creaky floorboards and coffee brewed too strong. The apartment wasn't much, just a couch that folded into a bed, a kitchenette with a leaky faucet, and a tiny balcony that overlooked nothing special. But it was hers, and for the first time in years, that was enough. She spent her mornings reading in the sunlight, that filtered through lace curtains, her afternoons walking nowhere in particular, her evenings writing, though she never finished anything, and some nights, when the wind whistled through the bricks just right, she'd find herself standing on that narrow balcony, staring out into the dark, remembering the sound of snow against the window pane, the flicker of firelight, the way his voice had dropped when he said, "Then let me." She never said it aloud, but she missed him, not in the way she expected, not with longing or regret, but with something gentler, something that made room for stillness and space. That's why, when the doorbell rang, one Wednesday just after sunset, she wasn't expecting anything. Certainly not the man standing there. Julian Cross didn't look like a CEO on that doorstep. No suit, no driver, no curated presence. Just a man in a gray wool coat, cheeks flushed from the wind, hair tousled, something wooden and narrow, tucked beneath one arm. For a moment, Claire couldn't move. She just stared. Fingers still curled around the tea mug she hadn't set down. He didn't speak right away. He looked nervous. Really nervous, which, somehow, made her chest ache more than any of the silences between them. "Hi," he said, voice softer than she remembered. She opened the door, wider, but didn't step back. "Hi." He shifted slightly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Depends what you're interrupting." Julian cracked a small smile, then lifted the item under his arm and held it out. A violin case, worn, scratched, and wrapped with a faded leather strap. "I've had it since I was a teenager," he said. "It was the one thing of hers I kept after she died. My mom." Claire's breath caught. "I couldn't play it," he continued. "Not for years. Not after my father found me with it once and, well, he made sure I never picked it up again. He paused, but I kept it, even when I forgot why." Claire reached out slowly and ran her fingers over the rough edge of the case. "Why now?" Julian looked at her, and in his eyes, she didn't see certainty or persuasion. She saw a man bringing forward the one part of himself no one else had touched. "Because when you left," he said, "I realized I'd spent most of my life building things to prove I was strong. But that violin, like you, it reminded me of the parts I buried, the parts that hurt, the parts that feel, and I don't want to bury them anymore." She looked down, then back up. "I didn't ask you to come," she said gently. "I know. I didn't say I forgave you. I know that too." She hesitated. "So why are you really here?" Julian took a step closer, held the violin case tighter against his chest. "Because this is the first thing I've brought to someone without knowing what I'll get in return." Claire stared at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. He walked past her slowly, his presence quiet, careful, like someone walking through a room full of memories. She closed the door behind him. They sat on the floor, not the couch. No lights except the string of bulbs hanging loosely across her bookshelf. She poured him tea from the same kettle she'd been holding, and for a while they didn't speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because sometimes what matters most is sitting beside someone who didn't turn away. Later, when he opened the violin case and ran his fingers across the strings, just once Claire closed her eyes. Not to shut anything out, but to let something in. 6 months later. Claire stood at the edge of another porch, this time wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and rain. The cabin wasn't the same one. This one sat a little higher up the ridge. Smaller, less polished, but no less quiet. The pine trees still whispered when the wind moved through them. The lake still slept under a sheet of early spring fog. The fire inside still crackled, but it wasn't the fire that warmed her. It was the way Julian's arms fit around her from behind, chin resting lightly on her shoulder, his breath steady against the side of her neck. They didn't speak. Not at first. There was no need. Some silences didn't ask to be filled. Some silences held more truth than anything spoken. When she finally broke it, her voice was soft. Do you remember the first night back at the other cabin Julian gave a small, knowing hum? You mean when you tried to hate me? Claire smiled. I really, really tried. I could tell. I didn't try very hard. No, you didn't. They both laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that knew sorrow. The kind born from surviving something, not a disaster, not a fire, not even heartbreak, but from surviving the version of yourself who once believed you had to be alone to be safe. Julian pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I still don't know what this is, Claire whispered. This us. Julian was quiet for a moment, his arms tightening slightly. I don't either. But I know I'm not pretending anymore, and that's something. She turned to face him, brushing a hand through his hair, now longer than before, a little wilder. You still burn the toast. I never claimed I didn't. And you walk around barefoot trying to write app ideas into your phone at midnight. They're terrible ideas. They're truly terrible. He grinned, boyish and open, in a way she had never seen when he wore a suit. She studied him. And for the first time, it wasn't with hesitation. It was with recognition. I was scared, she said. When I left that cabin, I didn't think I'd hear from you again. I almost didn't reach out, Julian admitted. I thought maybe I'd ruined it already. Maybe giving you space meant letting you go. She shook her head. Giving me space meant you finally saw me. Inside the cabin. The kettle began to whistle softly. Claire moved to step away, but Julian caught her hand. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, simple object wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully. A key, not to an empire, not to a penthouse or a tower. Just a key. To my place, he said, voice quieter now. The real one, not the penthouse. Not the one with the staff and the meetings and the view. She blinked. You mean the one with the ugly green couch and the guitar you never learned to play and a violin that needs tuning, he added. Claire held the key, feeling its cool weight in her palm. Are you asking me to move in? I'm asking you to let this be real. However it wants to be. No expectations. No timeline. Just real. She looked down at the key again, and she saw it. Sunday mornings. Coffee mugs side by side. Arguments over takeout orders. Laughter in the hallway. Silence in the dark that didn't feel like distance, but peace. She saw nights spent in shared quiet. Days spent learning how to stay. She saw a home, not perfect, but honest. Claire looked back at Julian and, without another word, slid the key into the pocket of her coat. Later that morning, they cooked breakfast together, burned eggs and too much toast, same as always. Julian cracked a yolk on the counter. Claire knocked over the pepper. It was messy and warm and filled with the kind of laughter that spilled through the open windows. After they finished eating, Julian began to clean up while Claire stood at the sink, spoon in hand, suddenly very still. What he asked, turning from the stove. She tilted her head, looking at him with a faint smile. You know, I never answered your question. What question? That first night, when you asked why I came to the cabin. Julian leaned against the counter, waiting. I told you I needed quiet, she said. He nodded. You did. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. I lied. Julian's brows rose gently. Yeah, I didn't need quiet, she said. I needed to be seen. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he walked to her, took the spoon gently from her hand, set it in the sink, and placed both hands on her face, like he was holding something he was afraid to break. I see you, Claire, he said, and I don't want to look away. She didn't respond. She didn't have to, because this time she didn't turn her face. This time, she didn't walk out the door. This time, she stayed. And as the snow melted outside and the trees began to whisper with green again, they packed up the car and drove back down the mountain, not as strangers, not as promises, but as two people learning to walk beside each other, not perfect, but real. And sometimes, real is exactly what the heart's been waiting for. Life doesn't always offer second chances in loud, dramatic ways. Sometimes, it offers them in the form of a quiet cabin, a shared silence, or the unexpected presence of someone you thought you'd never truly know. This story reminds us that healing doesn't happen all at once. It begins in small moments when we allow ourselves to be seen without masks, when we admit we're tired of pretending, when we stop choosing safety over truth. As we grow older, it becomes easier to stay in what feels familiar, even if it no longer feels right. But real connection, the kind that softens years of distance, often begins with a single brave choice to stay, to speak, to see. It's never too late to unlearn silence. It's never too late to choose something real. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is simply staying long enough to be understood. Thank you for spending time with this story. If it touched something quietly true in you, or reminded you of a part of yourself you've almost forgotten, we're grateful you stayed. If you believe in stories that heal, connect, and speak gently to the heart, we invite you to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Because sometimes, all it takes is one story to remind us we were never truly alone.